I want to start with a text, a headline from today's New York Times business section. I quote, "At UBS, it's the culture that's rogue." I want to talk first about culture and commerce, and then return to our own times, and even fleetingly to UBS. Culture, which is a principle of unity, an organization of the world, said Thomas Mann, is also a principle of difference. It's almost always counterposed in ordinary usage to other cultures or other principles. Multicultural societies are thus identified as societies in which individuals are clustered into distinct, inherited identities or communities. The high culture of music and literature is counterposed to the popular culture of different music and different literature. In the two cultures of the Victorian imagination, the arts and the sciences were presumed to be distinct and mutually uncomprehending. Culture itself is counterposed to its closest correlates. Culture is the opposite of civilization, Thomas Mann wrote during the First World War. Well, one of the most persistent oppositions in this continuing history of differences is between culture and commerce. The young Wilhelm Meister in Goethe's novel is torn between the Sibylline figure of theatre and the pitiful, wrinkled spirit of groceries, the poetry of the imaginary and the poetry of the true. The bourgeois, or the burgher, the Philistine, the man without culture, is a figure of derision in European theatre, from the bourgeois gentilhomme who speaks prose without knowing it, to the archive-accumulating East India Company merchant in the play The Nabob, to Baron Ochs in Der Rosenkavalier. But commerce has also been identified, since well before Goethe's time, as the companion of culture. Commerce is, on the one hand, a condition of culture. It's the source of culture in the sense that merchants and manufacturers have been the patrons of music and philosophy, painting and literature. It's the medium of culture in the sense of the distribution and reproduction of sounds, images, and ideas. An age of philosophers and poets, in David Hume's description, was likely to be one of opulence. It was also likely to be an age in which ethics would not be neglected and in which women and men would have easy and sociable conversations. Adam Smith believed that as societies became richer, more civilized, and more secure, so individuals within these societies would become ever more interested in the pleasures of the imagination and the study of philosophy. Culture, in the narrow sense of the arts and humanities, was connected to commerce, and so too was culture in the more extensive sense of ways of thinking about the world. The most opulent societies of the modern world used to be described as culture-intensive in the 1990s. They were societies or economies in which an increasing proportion of the goods, and especially the services consumed, were the ones which were organized around sounds and images and ideas. Tourism, entertainment, films and publishing, education, all of these were among the expanding industries of the early 21st century. Culture has, on the other hand, been identified as a condition of commerce. Culture, in Mann's extensive sense of an intellectual organization of the world, or in Jacob Burckhardt's sense of habits of thought and mental attitudes, was considered for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries to be the most important determinant of economic success. Economic theory, for the historical schools of political economy, which flourished throughout Europe, Asia, and North America in the 19th century, was to be, and I quote, economic cultural history. Even Max Weber, for whom much of historical political economy was little more than what he described as an anthropologically veiled mysticism, identified the specific and peculiar rationalism of Western culture as the condition of modern capitalist enterprise. Well, 20th century economic theorists turned away, in general, from this preoccupation with culture. They required little more in their scientific work than a postulate of what was described as rationality or of maximizing behavior. This was, to quote Max Weber, the impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain, of money, of the greatest possible amount of money, of which Weber went on to say that it has been common to all sorts and conditions of men at all times and in all countries of the earth. Weber also added, interestingly enough, that it had almost nothing to do with capitalism. I quote Weber, "It should be taught in the kindergarten of cultural history that this naive idea of capitalism must be given up once and for all." Towards the end of the 20th century, there was a new cultural turn in economic thought. One manifestation within popular economic history, and to some extent within development economics, took the form of a proliferation of models of the cultural, mental, and religious sources of economic success. The Protestant ethic was succeeded by the Catholic spirit, as in the economic exuberance of Southern Europe, and the Confucian worldview, as in the Japanese miracle. I think from years after the sort of discussions of the Hindu rate of growth, there's now the Hindu route to economic success being touted. It's very dusty up here. Actually, I might move a bit. An American or Anglo-Saxon model of economic competition was contrasted to a European or Franco-German model of economic organization. Those rather shallow cross-section regressions that Joe Stiglitz was talking about last night have recently looked at such matters as culture as legal institutions, and in particular the influence of having been colonized by the British on economic success many years later. A second cultural turn was evident within economic theory itself. There was, by the end of the 18th century, a new interest in the evolution of norms and institutions, in the uses of information, and in the experimental and other connections between economics and psychology. No, thanks. I think I'm fine, I hope. As economic science was increasingly concerned with industrial organization, with the theory of the enterprise rather than the theory of the national economy, and to some extent with businesses rather than with government departments, the culture of the enterprise became the subject of increasing interest. The enterprise, or the firm, was an island of non-market relationships within an ocean of competition, and the economic theory of the firm, the organization, was of necessity a theory of collective or contested norms. Well, the third version of the cultural turn has been within political thought. Culture has come to be seen as the condition for the flourishing and even for the continuing existence of the capitalist system. The cultural or religious or psychological explanations for differences in national economic experience have proved elusive, and the information cultures of different firms have proved difficult to depict. But almost all political and economic theories of the market system have been obliged to consider the culture as well as the political institutions within which market relations subsist. The great Chicago economist, Frank Knight, wrote in 1934 that the history of economic individualism and political laissez-faire had from the outset been a race between growth and decline. The system of free enterprise had eventually become unsustainable, in Frank Knight's description, because the growth of inequality and of monopoly power had made the economic game intolerably unfair. The game of liberal politics, too, was unsustainable for Knight because it, too, tended to deteriorate into a monopoly of power, including the power to persuade. Knight's principal hope in these circumstances was to be found in the intellectual or moral culture within which political institutions were embedded and within which they could in turn influence economic or social outcomes. Well, in our own early 21st century epoch of discontent with the cultural foundations of capitalism, Knight's apprehensions are of continuing importance. Inequality, which Knight saw as the most obvious shortcoming of economic liberalism, is the subject of extensive and global discussion. It's considered by many to have reached the dimensions which Frank Knight described as, I quote Frank Knight, gross, in which, I quote him still, all ethical defenses of freedom lose their validity. Insecurity, which was for Knight the second shortcoming of economic liberalism, is also seen as gross. Frank Knight wrote also in 1934, "We pass by way of a crushing competitivism to a worship of emotional unity, and by way of intolerable insecurity to morbid craving for security." Insecurity, in our own times, is widely perceived as an inevitable concomitant of modern capitalism. It is the more gross for the opponents of global commerce to the extent that it's the outcome of invisible and distant decisions. Well, injustice was for Frank Knight a third shortcoming of economic and political liberalism. The political system, after a decade of political scandals and private greed in the 1920s, was perceived as unfair and, continuing to quote Knight, subject to the use of salesmanship or influence. In the connected world of the modern global economy, this sense of ubiquitous injustice, too, is widespread. It takes strikingly different forms in different societies or cultures. It might seem intolerable in the civil society of health professionals that children with tuberculosis are untreated. Or it might seem intolerable in the culture constituted by the tens of thousands of shareholders in Enron some years ago, that it was the richest and best connected executives who sold at high prices and the least secure retired employees who were left with worthless investments. Irreverence, or the loss of respect even for oneself or one's own values, was the fourth and the most insidious of the shortcomings that Knight described in the early 1930s. It, too, is a modern condition. It is, in a sense, the most engaging of all modern conditions. The individualism of liberal societies, the discussion of everything, the buying and selling of all goods, is irreverent with respect to established institutions of all sorts. It is disrespectful of the state, of power, of traditional religion, of the political process, of leadership. But it is thereby disrespectful or disruptive, too, of its own future. For if liberal societies tend to produce inequalities, insecurities, injustices, then they must also be able to reduce these ills, these non-goods, to tolerable dimensions. They must be able to do so, moreover, in a process which is itself respected. There must be something within the society which is self-improving and revered. Well, this, I think, is the problem, in a profound sense, of the cultural sources of modern commercial society. Different political philosophers have identified different conditions which constitute this irreducible inner resource. For some, everything is to be disputed except the Constitution. For others, everything that is worldly is to be disputed, and its established religion, which is to be respected. For yet others, it is the patriotic, including the military functions of the state, which are worthy of reverence. For Adam Smith and David Hume, it was, I think, the nature of individuals, their essential good humor and reflectiveness, which was the eventual source of the resilience of liberal societies. Frank Knight's own recourse was similar to Smith's and Hume's. It was, in his words, a combination of intellectual moral leadership and the sense of tolerance and humanity, friendliness and good humor, which he took to be characteristic of commercial societies. Culture, in the extensive sense of a way of thinking, is from these perspectives at the heart of the liberal future. The free market requires free and open political institutions which are capable of reducing the insecurity and inequality of commercial societies. Free political institutions, in turn, require a way of thinking about the world, or a political culture which is capable of striving for justice and being reverent in respect of the rules of free discussion. Commerce transforms every individual into a merchant of sorts, into a shareholder, but it's only likely to thrive when every individual is also free and reflects from time to time about the organization of the world. Well, let me return, in conclusion, to the present. In 1929, Herbert Hoover commissioned a report called Recent Social Trends in the United States, which was published just before he left office in early 1933. It was an inquiry, really, into American culture and also into the causes of the economic and financial crisis of the times, including, and I quote, wait for it, ignorant, inefficient, and lax public supervision over the financial institutions of the country, the excessive multiplication of credit, the colossal wave of speculation in urban real estate, and the purchase by banks of securities, I quote, normally regarded as unfit for banking investment. It was a study, in part, of the consequences of the new financial, or as we might now say, financialized economy of the 1920s, including the development of, quoting the report, arts of financing and selling, and the proliferation of bankers, brokers, insurance, and real estate agents. It was an investigation of the financialization of politics, in which, I quote, graft and bunkum have been common. It was also, and most portentously, an inquiry into what the Commission called the problem of the interrelationship between government and industry. There were, I quote, new forms now only dimly discerned and, quoting, semi- and demi-autonomous industrial groupings in varying relations to the state. Practically, the line between pure economics and pure politics has been blurred in recent years. I continue to quote, shall businessmen become actual rulers, or shall rulers become industrialists? Well, this continuing transformation in the state was a familiar preoccupation in the early history of economic thought. So too was the change in economic culture and in the rules, norms, and sentiments of daily commerce at home and abroad. These changes were much discussed, in particular, in the founding or original epoch of modern economic theory, which was also roughly the original epoch of the US Constitution. Adam Smith is sometimes described as having discovered the market, but The Wealth of Nations was an inquiry, rather, into the relationship between the market and the state and how it changes in different circumstances, as it was changing sometimes dizzyingly in Smith's own times. I've just published a book called The Inner Life of Empires, which is an attempt to really look at what it was like to live in a period of economic change in Adam Smith's times, including changes in economic sentiments and economic norms from the point of view of a large, unruly Scottish family who were friends of David Hume and Adam Smith and were involved both in high culture and in commerce. They were called the Johnstons. One of the Johnston brothers and Adam Smith's oldest and closest friends asked in the House of Commons in 1774 in a debate about the East India Company, I quote, "What is the state? And what if you say the company is the state?" So, does commerce destroy culture, including economic culture? No. It's just as the relationship between the market and the state is a continuing evolution over time, so is the relationship between capitalism, commerce, and its cultural foundations. Friedrich Hayek, who didn't agree with Frank Knight about very much, thought that individuals who were participants in market games had a moral obligation to play by the rules of those games. But of course, one of the difficulties of the culture of UBS and of our own times is that the rules are changing very fast indeed. The financialized economy of the 1990s and the past decade is protected by government. It's often attributed to the freeing of the financial industries from government regulation in 2000, but I think much more profoundly, it's developed precisely under the protection of Depression-era regulatory institutions. But one of the sources of the securitization sub-industry, to take one example, has been regulatory arbitrage. I think in a period in which professional ethics in banking and insurance are also changing, it's been characterized by what one could call ethical arbitrage. Clearly, the financialization of the economy is mirrored by financialization of politics of exactly the sort that worried Frank Knight so much in 1934 and that worried Hoover's Commission in 1933. But I think there's also something much newer, which the Commission in 1933 hinted at in a very vague way. And that's something that I could call the financialization of the state. That is to say, not only that policies are short-term, which has been very much discussed, but that even the cast of characters, at least the cast of characters who are concerned with economic and financial policy of the most important sort, is short-term. There are new experts who come in. So for Adam Smith, as for Frank Knight, there are really two things that destroy free commerce and capitalism. One is extreme inequality, and the other is market power, including the power to buy rules and norms. And this, I think, is the risk to economic culture now. Thank you very much.